Hey, fourth graders. All right, so this is Alcatraz versus the Evil Librarians. We stopped in the middle of chapter 7. If you recall from yesterday, the Smedries were infiltrating the library. Sing Sing Smedry um, tripped epically and like crashed over a chair, and he's a huge guy, and he hit a bookshelf and like tipped over the bookshelf even though it was bolted to the ground and caused this big commotion. And so Alcatraz and his dad and Bastille and Quentin all went over to the employee only entrance, and there was like a hand reader, but Alcatraz kind of put his hand on it and it broke the door and the hand reader. And so they got in, and eventually Sing Sing was able to get away from all the people who were trying to help him, and he also got in. So they have all gone into the employee only section of the library, and Grandpa Smedry told Bastille that she was going to go with Alcatraz, and she said, "No, my job is to protect you." And he was like, "No, no, no. Alcatraz is also an oculator, so it's important to be protecting him. That's part of your job, but also he's going to need your help more than I will." And so Grandpa and Quentin are going off together, and then Sing, Bastille, and Alcatraz are together. And we left just as Quentin waved goodbye and says, "Rutabaga, fire over the inheritance," he said, then rushed after the elderly oculator. Sing and Bastille turned to me. "It looks like I'm in charge," I thought with surprise. This was a strange realization. Yes, I know. Grandpa Smedry had already said that I would have to lead my group. I shouldn't have been surprised to find myself in this situation. The truth is, however, that I was never the sort of person that people put in charge. Those kinds of duties generally go to the types of boys and girls who deliver apples, answer questions, and smile a lot. Leadership duties do not generally go to boys whose desks collapse, who are often accused of playing pranks by removing the doorknobs of school bathrooms, and who once unwittingly made a friend's pants fall down while he was writing on the chalkboard. I never did manage to get that stunt to work again. I guess we go this way," I said, pointing down the hallway. "You think?" Bastille said flatly, handing Sing his gym bag of guns. She pulled a pair of sunglasses, warrior's lenses, as the others called them, out of her jacket pocket and slipped them on. Then she took off, walking down the hallway, handbag flipped around her shoulder. If I order her to go back and follow Grandpa instead, I wonder if she'll go, he thought. I decided that she probably wouldn't. "Say, Alcatraz," Sing said as we followed Bastille. "What do you suppose this little wrap on my ankle means?" I frowned, glancing down. "The bandage?" "Oh," Sing said. "Is that what it is? First aid, it is called, correct?" "Yes," I said. "Why else would someone wrap your ankle like that?" Sig glanced down, obviously trying to inspect the ankle bandage while still walking. "Oh, I don't know," he said. "I thought maybe it was some preliminary courtship ritual." He trailed off, looking toward me hopefully. "No," I said, "not a chance." So courtship is like dating. So he's thinking that like, oh, maybe she put this bandage on my foot and that means that we're going to start dating. And Alcatraz says, "No, not a chance." "That's sad," Sing said. "She was pretty." Is that the sort of thing you should be thinking about?" I asked. "I mean, you're an anthropologist. You study cultures. Are you allowed to interfere with the natives you meet?" "What?" Sing said. "Of course we can. Why, we're here to interfere. We're trying to overthrow librarian domination of the Hushlands, after all." "Why not just let people live their lives and live yours?" Sing looked taken aback. "Alcatraz, the Hushlanders are enslaved. They're being kept in ignorance, living only with the most primitive technologies. Besides, we need to do something to fight back. Back at the Conclave of Kings, some people are starting to talk about surrendering to the librarians completely." He shook his head. "I'm glad for people like your grandfather, people willing to take the fight into librarian lands. It shows that we won't just sit back and slowly have our kingdoms taken from us." Up ahead, Bastille glared back at us. "Would you two like to chat a little more?" she snapped. "Perhaps sing a little tune. If there are any librarians up ahead, we won't want them to miss out on hearing us coming." Sing looked at his feet sheepishly, and we fell silent, though a part of me wanted to yell something like, What did you say, Bastille? As loudly as I could. You see, that is the sad, terrible thing about sarcasm. It's really funny. But I just walked quietly, thinking about what Singh had said, particularly the part about librarians only letting Hushlanders have the most primitive of technologies. It seemed ridiculous to me that the Free Kingdomers considered things like guns and automobiles to be primitive. They weren't primitive, they were what I knew. Growing up in America, I'd come to assume that everything I had and did was the newest, best, and most advanced in the world. It was very unsettling to be confronted by people who weren't impressed by how advanced my culture was. I wanted to huff and think that whatever they had must not be all that good either. Except the problem was that I'd seen they had self-driving cars, glasses that could track a person's footprints, and armored knights. All were, in one way or another, superior to what I'd known. Admit it, knights are just cool. I was coming to realize something very difficult. I was slowly accepting that the way I did things, the way my people did things, might not actually be the best way. In other words, I was feeling humility. Now, it's kind of an interesting thing, right? We in America often think that, we have the best stuff, we're the most advanced, that sort of thing. And in reality, we kind of are, but we also tend to think that the way that we do things is the best way to do things. There's other cultures where they just live differently than we live, and we tend to think that our way is the best, but maybe it's not. There could be things that people in, I don't know, Indonesia or something do that if we really looked at it, we might be like, oh, that's actually better than what we're doing. It's possible. So just kind of takes a little humility to look and see if another culture maybe does have something that you could stand to learn from, even if you think that your culture is the best. I sincerely hope that you never have to feel this emotion. No, you should definitely feel humility. Like asparagus and fish, it's really not as good for you as everyone says it is. Those are good things for you. You should eat those things. Selfishness, arrogance, and callousness got me much farther than humility ever did. Okay, Alcatraz. I have mentioned that I'm not really a very good, or have I mentioned that I'm not really a very good person? Our small group reached the end of the unmarked hallway, Bastille still in the lead. She paused, holding up a hand, peeking around the corner. Then she continued onward, her platform sandals making a slight noise as she stepped on the carpeted floor. Singh and I followed. The room beyond was filled with books. Really filled. Perhaps you've never experienced the full suffocating majesty of a true library. You Hushlanders have probably visited your local libraries. You've perused the parts that normal people are allowed to see. These places tend to have row upon row of neat bookshelves arranged nicely. They are presented attractively for the same reason that kittens are cute, so that they can draw you in, then pounce on you for the kill. Seriously, stay away from kittens. Public libraries exist to entice. The librarians want everyone to read their books, whether those books are deep and poignant works about dead puppies or nonfiction books about made-up topics like the Pilgrims, Penicillin, and France. In fact, the only book they don't want you to read is the one you're holding right now. Those aren't real libraries, however. Real libraries take little concern for enticement. You have visited the basement stacks. You who have visited the basement stacks of a university library's philosophy section know what I'm talking about. In such places, the shelves get squeezed closer and closer together, and they reach higher and higher. Piles of books appear randomly at junctions and in corners waiting to be shelved, like the fourth-generation descendants of a copy of Summa Theologica and an edition of Little Women. Dust settles on the books like a gray perversion of rain forest moss, giving the air a certain moldy, unwelcome scent, faintly reminiscent of a Bale dragon's lair. At each corner, you expect to turn and see the withered skeletal remains of some poor researcher who got lost in the stacks and never found his way out. And even those kinds of libraries are but pale apprentices to the enormous cavern of books that I entered that day. We walked quietly, passing shelves packed so tightly together that only an anorexic racing jockey could have squeezed between them. The bookshelves were easily 15 feet high, and enormous plaques on the end proclaimed in very small letters the titles each one contained. Long wooden poles with pincer-like hooks leaned against some shelves, and I got the impression they were used for reaching between the shelves to pull out books. No, I thought, it would take a ridiculous amount of practice to learn to do something like that. I must be wrong. You may have guessed that I wasn't actually wrong. You see, librarian apprentices have plenty of time to practice things that are ridiculous. They really only have three duties. First, to learn the incredibly and needlessly complicated filing system used to catalog books in the back library stacks. Second, to practice the book with the book hooks. And third, to plot ways to torture an innocent populace. The third one is the most fun, kind of like gym class for the murderously insane. Sing, Bastille, and I crept along the rows, careful to keep an eye out for librarian apprentices. This was undoubtedly the most dangerous thing I'd ever done in my short life. Fortunately, we were able to get to the eastern edge of the room without incident. We should move along the wall, Bastille said quietly, so Alcatraz can look down each row of books. That way he might see powerful sources of occultation. Sing nodded. But we should move quickly. We need to find the sands and get out fast before the librarians realize they've been infiltrated. They looked at me expectantly. That sounds good, I said finally. You've got this leadership thing down, Smedry, Bastille said flatly. Very inspiring. Come on then, let's keep moving. Bastille and Sing began to walk along the wall. I, however, didn't follow. I had just noticed something hanging on the wall above us, a very large painting that appeared to be an ornate, detailed map of the world, and it looked nothing like the one I was used to. Chapter 8. At this point, you're probably expecting to read something like, I suddenly realized that everything I thought I had known was untrue. Though I'll likely use that exact phrase, I should warn you that it is actually misleading. Everything I knew was not untrue. In fact, many of the things I'd learned about the world were quite true. For instance, I knew that the sun came up every day. That was not untrue, though admittedly the sun shone on a geography I didn't understand. I knew that my homeland was named the United States of America. That was not true, though the USA was not actually run by senators, presidents, and judges, but instead by a cult of evil librarians. I knew that sharks were annoying. This also was not untrue. There's actually nothing witty to add here. Sharks are annoying, particularly the carnivorous kind. You have been warned. I stared up at the enormous wall map and suddenly realized something. Everything I thought I'd known about the world was untrue. This can't be real, I whispered, stepping back. I'm afraid it is, Alcatraz, Sing said, laying a hand on my shoulder. That's the world, the entire world, both the Hushlands and the Free Kingdoms. This is the thing the librarians don't want you to know about. I stared. But it's so big. And indeed it was. The Americas were there, represented accurately. The other continents, Asia, Africa, Australia, and the rest, were all there as well. They were collectively labeled Inner Liberia on the map, but I recognized them easily enough. The difference then was the new continents. There were 3 of them, pressed into the oceans between the familiar continents. 2 of the new continents were smaller, perhaps the size of Australia. One, however, was very large. It sat directly in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, right between America and Japan. It's impossible, I said. We would have noticed the landmass like that sitting in the middle of the ocean. You think you would have noticed, Singh said. But the truth is that the librarians control the information in your country. How often have you personally been out sailing in the middle of what you call the Pacific Ocean? I paused. But just because I haven't been there doesn't mean anything. The ocean is like kangaroos and grandfathers. I believe that other people have seen it. Ship captains, airline pilots, satellite images. Satellites are controlled by the librarians, Bastille said, regarding the map through her sunglasses. Your pilots fly guided by the instruments and the maps that the librarians provide, and not many people sail boats in your culture, particularly not into the deep ocean. Those who do are bribed, threatened, brainwashed, or, most often, carefully misled. Singh nodded. Those other continents make sense if you think about it. I mean, a planet that is 70% water, what would be the point of that much wasted space? I'd never have thought people would buy that lie, and had I not studied Hushlander culture. People go along with what they're told, Bastille said. Every Even intelligent people believe what they read and hear, assuming they're given no reason to question. I shook my head. A hidden gas station I can believe, but this isn't some little cover up or misdirection. There are 3 new continents on that map. Not new, Singh said. The cultures of the Three Kingdoms are quite well established. Indeed, they are far more advanced than the Hushlander cultures. Bastille nodded. The librarians conquered the backward sections of the world first. They're easier to control. I said. What about Columbus? What about history? Lies, Singh said quietly. Fabrications, many of them. The rest are distortions. I mean, haven't you always wondered why your people supposedly developed guns after more technologically advanced weapons, like swords? No! Swords aren't more advanced than guns. Singh and Bastille shared a glance. That's what they want you to believe, Alcatraz, Singh said. That way the librarians can keep the powerful technology to themselves. Do you think it's strange that nobody in your culture carries swords anymore? No, I said, holding up my hand. Singh, most people don't carry swords, or even guns. You've been beaten down, Bastille said quietly. You're docile, controlled. We're happy, I said. Yes, Singh said. You're quite quiet, happy, and completely ignorant, just like you're supposed to be. Don't you have a phrase, ignorance is bliss? The librarians came up with that one, Bastille said. I shook my head. No, I said, this is too much. I was willing to overlook the self-driving cars, the magic glasses. Well, they could be some kind of trick. Sneaking into a library, that sounded fun, but this is ridiculous. I can't accept it. And likely you Hushlanders are thinking the very same thing. You're saying to yourself, the story just lost me. It degenerated into pure silliness, and since only silly people enjoy silliness, I'm going to read a book about a boy whose dog gets killed by his mother. Twice. Well, if only silly people enjoy silliness, then you 4th graders should be enjoying this no problem, because, let's be honest, you're plenty silly. Before you embark upon your voyage of caninicide, that's killing of dogs, I'd like to offer a single argument for your consideration. Plato. Plato was a funny little Greek man who lived a long time ago. He is probably best known for 2 things. First, for writing stories about his friends, and second, for philosophically proving that somewhere in the eternities there exists a perfect slice of cheesecake. Okay, we're just going to skip this next part. At this moment, however, the reader will be less interested in cheesecake and more interested in caves. One cave, to be specific. Plato tells a story about a group of prisoners who live in a very special cave. The prisoners were tied up, heads held so they could only face one direction, and all they could see was the wall in front of them. A fire behind them threw shadows on this wall, and these shadows were the only things the prisoners ever knew. To them, the shadows were their world. As far as they knew, there was nothing else. However, one of these prisoners was eventually released and saw the world was much more than just shadows. At first, he found this new world very, very strange. Once he learned of it, however, he returned and tried to tell his friends about it. They, however, didn't trust him and didn't want to listen to him. They didn't want to believe in this new world because it didn't make sense to them. You Hushlanders are like these people. You have, through no fault of your own, lived your entire life believing in the shadows the librarians have shown you. The things I reveal in this narrative will seem like nonsense to you. There is no getting around this. No matter how logical my arguments are, they will seem illogical to you. Your mind, struggling to find ways to hold on to your librarian lies, will think of all kinds of ridiculous concerns. You will ask questions such as, but what about tidal patterns? Or, but how can you explain the lack of increased fuel costs created by airplanes flying around these hidden land masses? Since nothing I can say will be able to pierce your delusions, let the fact that I make no arguments stand as ultimate proof that I am right. So in other words, let the fact that I'm not trying to prove that I'm right tell you that I am in fact right. As Plato once said, that his friend Socrates once said, I know that I am right because I'm the only person humble enough to admit that I'm not. Or something like that. I stood for a long moment staring at that map. Part of me, most of me, resisted what I was seeing, and yet the things I had experienced bounced around in my head, reminding me of that many things, like gas station coolers and young men who set fires to kitchens, were not always as simple as they appeared. I'll deal with this later, I finally said, turning away from the map. Let's keep moving. Finally, Bastille said, you Hushlanders, honestly, sometimes it seems like it would take a hammer to the face to get you to wake up and see the truth. Now, Bastille, Singh said as we walked by a long, low filing cabinet. That really isn't fair. I think young Lord Smedry is doing quite well, all things considered. It isn't every day that... Gack! Singh said this last part as he suddenly and without apparent reason tripped and fell to the ground. I frowned looking down, but Bastille burst into motion. She hopped dexterously over Singh, then grabbed me by the arm and threw me to the ground behind the filing cabinet. She ducked down beside me. Why? I began, rubbing my arm in annoyance. Bastille, however, clapped a hand over my mouth, shooting me a very hostile, very persuasive, silencing look. I fell quiet. Then I heard something. Voices approaching. Bastille removed her hand, then carefully peeked out over the filing cabinet. I moved to do likewise, but Bastille shot me another glance. I could see the glare even through her sunglasses. This time, however, I refused to be cowed. If she can look, so can I thought stubbornly. I didn't spend 13 years being a troublemaker so I could get pushed around by a girl my age, even if she is a pretty good shot with that handbag of hers. I peeked over the cabinet. In the distance, moving between two lines of enormous bookshelves, I could see a group of figures. Most looked like they were wearing dark robes. Librarian apprentices, Singh whispered, peeking up beside me. Doing their tasks. Somewhere in this room, the master librarians have placed one misfiled volume. The apprentices have to find it. I eyed the nearly endless rows of tightly packed bookshelves. That could take years, I whispered. Singh nodded. Some go insane from the pressure. They are usually the ones who get promoted first. I shivered as the group moved off. There were a couple of much larger figures following them, and these weren't dressed in robes. They were entirely white, and their bodies moved in a not quite natural manner. They lumbered as they stepped, arms held too far to the sides. They trailed behind the librarian apprentices, moving with ponderous steps, some carrying stacks of books. I squinted, looking closer. The whitish figures glowed slightly, giving off a dark haze. The apprentices and the white figures turned a corner, disappearing from view. What were those? I whispered. Those white things that were with them. Enlivened, Bastille said, shivering. She glanced at me, standing up. When Singh trips, Smedry always duck. You trip whenever there's danger? Of course not, Singh said. I only trip when there's danger and when tripping... Sorry, let me restart that. Of course not, Singh said. I only trip when there's danger and when tripping will be helpful. Or at least that's usually the way it works. Better than your talent, Oculator, Bastille said with a snort. Do you want to tell me how you managed to break the carpet? I glanced down. The carpet lay unraveling around me, separated into individual strands of yarn. Come on, Bastille said. We should keep moving. I nodded, as did Singh, and we continued along the perimeter of the musty library chamber. We walked in silence. The sight of the apprentices had reminded us of the need for stealth. However, it quickly grew apparent to me that searching through that room wouldn't lead us to the sands of Rashid. Despite the room's many alcoves, the thousands upon thousands of bookshelves made it feel like a cubicle-filled office for demonic bibliophiles. Let's see. Okay, so cubicles are like office spaces where you have like a one big room and then you put up a whole bunch of like little small walls to like give everybody their own little space. If you've glanced into Mrs. Markley's room, she has the little plastic dividers to keep the kids from, make it so that they can be facing each other without causing issues. Those are kind of like cubicles, but basically they don't have to be clear. They can be solid, but basically they're little three walls that kind of go around and you just have your office space inside. So he's saying it felt like a whole bunch of little smalled off offices for demonic bibliophiles. Bibliophiles are people who really love books and reading. It didn't seem like the kind of place where one kept objects of great power. I figured that the sands would be in a locked room, or perhaps a laboratory, not a vast storage chamber. I spotted a stairwell to the right and waved to the others. We should go up to the second floor. Bastille raised an eyebrow. We haven't finished checking this room yet. We don't have time, I said, glancing at the hourglass Grandpa Smedry had given me. This room is too big. Besides, it doesn't feel right. We're going to let the fate of the world rest on your feelings, she said flatly. He is our oculator, Bastille, Singh reminded her. If he says we go up, then we go up. Besides, he's probably right. The sands aren't likely to be here in the stacks. Somewhere in this building should be a lens forge. That's where they've probably got the sands. Bastille sighed, then shrugged. Whatever, she said, pushing past me to lead the way up the stairs. Or lead the way toward the stairs. I was a little bit surprised that they'd listen to me. I followed Bastille, and Singh took the rear. The stairwell was made of stone, and it reminded me distinctly of something one might find in a medieval castle. It wound in circles around itself and was encased entirely in a massive stone pillar lit by little frosted windows that let in marginal amounts of daylight. After several minutes of climbing the steep steps, I was puffing. Shouldn't we have reached the second floor by now? Space distortion, Bastille said in front of me. You didn't honestly expect the librarians to confine their entire base into a building as small as this one looks. No, I said. I saw the stretching aura outside, but, how far up can this stairwell go? As far as it needs to, Bastille said testily. I sighed, but continued to climb. By that logic, the stairwell could go on forever. I didn't, however, want to contemplate that point. For how advanced you people always claim to be, I noted, you'd think the librarians would have elevators in their buildings. Bastille snorted. Elevators? How primitive. Well, they're better than stairs. Of course they aren't, Bastille said. It took society centuries to develop from the elevator to the flight of stairs. So she's saying that they had elevators before they had stairs. I frowned. That doesn't make any sense. Stairs are less advanced than elevators. She glanced over her shoulder, looking at me over the top of her sunglasses. I was annoyed to note that she didn't seem the least bit winded. Don't be silly, she said. Why would elevators be more advanced than stairs? Obviously, stairs take more effort to climb, are harder to construct, and are far more healthy to use. Therefore, they took longer to develop. Don't you realize how stupid you sound when you claim otherwise? No, I said, annoyed. The opposite is stupid to me. And does everything you say have to sound like an insult? Only when I intend to be insulting, she said, turning and resuming her climb. I sighed, looking back at Singh, who just shrugged and smiled, still carrying his gym bag of guns. We kept moving. Stairs are more advanced than elevators, I thought. Ridiculous. Caves, shadows, and cheesecake. We eventually reached the top of the stairwell, and it opened out into a long hallway constructed of stone blocks. Along this hallway was a line of large, thick wooden doors set into stone archways. This is more like it, I said. I'll bet the sands are behind one of these doors. Well, Bastille said, let's try one then. I nodded, then walked up to the first door. I listened at it for a moment, but either there was no sound on the other side, or the wood was so thick I couldn't hear anything. See any darkness around the door? Bastille whispered. I shook my head. The dark oculator probably isn't in there then, Bastille said quietly. It could open into anything, Singh said. But we'll never find the sands if we keep to the hallway, Bastille said. I glanced at the other doors. None of them seemed to glow any more than any of the others. Bastille was right. We had to start trying them, and any one was as good as the next. So I took a breath and pushed against the door in front of me. I'd intended to move it open slightly so we could peek in, but the door swung far more easily than I'd expected. It flew open, exposing the large room beyond, and I stumbled into the doorway. The room was filled with dinosaurs. Real, live, moving dinosaurs. One of them waved at me. I paused for a moment. Oh, I finally said. Is that all? I was worried that I might find something strange in here. And that is the end of chapter 8, which is a perfect ending. So we end with Alcatraz stepping into a room full of dinosaurs, apparently one of which waves to him. So I hope that you enjoyed this read aloud. It is almost 30 minutes of read aloud, so you should be more than satisfied. We will continue with chapter 9 on Thursday. So if you haven't watched this, if you haven't watched this, then you won't see this, so it doesn't even matter. All right, anyway, I hope you guys are having a good day. Hopefully you have checked in with me at some point, or will check in with me at some point. But yeah, that's it. I will talk to you later, and hopefully see you on Thursday. Bye.